Our final panel discussion is about parks, plazas, and public spaces, which in some way we've been talking about all day. But we're going to focus on them in detail now. I think, for me, the idea that civic horticulture, this conference in and of itself is telling us that this idea of horticulture in the city is having an incredible renaissance. We saw it in the work that we've seen so far. We're going to see it in the work of this panel. And in some ways, it feels like the stars are aligned to advance the role of horticulture in the city again today. And what do I mean by that? Well, at times of crisis, we have a tendency to return to the garden. I think you could describe today as a time of perceived crisis, whether it's environmental, social, or economic. And as I said, we've had a long history of returning to the garden at these times of crisis, and I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of Philadelphia. We see it even in the idea of the Obama poster that helped elect him in 2008, the idea that coming together around growth and progress, it's the idea of growth and change, the idea that we are growing together. The things that we grow ourselves. Even looking back to the Depression and the Depression-era posters of the WPA, Progress Again, focused around the role of growing. But I think it's important that we don't just think about the work, but we think about the rhetoric. We think about the way we talk about the work. And this is in part the challenge I've given the panel this afternoon. Because it's not just the work we do, but the work we do is influenced by the way we talk about it. And I want to start by going back to the beginning, and I'm not going to reprise exactly what David told you, but I'm going to talk about it in a slightly different way as introduction. Because even the power of this kind of imagery, the imagery of founding of Penn's Woods, the city of brotherly love in Penn's Woods, imagined here as a coming together under the treaty elm, nature and culture, city and wilderness. These things are being brought together under the image of the great treaty elm. But it's also important to know when Penn developed his holy experiment, it was really a real estate venture, right? He was selling property. He was back in London saying, here is a different kind of place to bring people to. It was described in contrast to the chaos of London, the Great Fire of 1666, and the plagues that always suffered throughout. And it was indeed the building of a green country town. To use his own words, he said, country life is to be preferred, for that we see the works of God. This is both the philosopher's garden and his library, a sweet and natural retreat from the noise and talk, and allows opportunity for reflection. So the idea that we're linking the garden, we're linking horticulture to intellectual growth and physical health from the very beginning. But by the 1840s, that idea was long gone. And Fairmount Park came out of another time of crisis, a time of riots over immigration and work. And out of this came Fairmount Park. And David talked about the idea of the waterworks as central, this idea of bringing the health, clean water to the city. But again, it wasn't just physical health, it was mental health. The stunning picture of Aiken's painting of Max Schmidt and his single skull, linking being on the Schuylkill, being in the park, to mental and physical well-being. This idea that mental and physical stamina, engaging the mind and body together in the nature's garden, that's what Fairmount Park was about. Reading the words of one of the great supporters of Fairmount Park, we hear words that could have been Olmsted's. The manners, morals, the political stability of our institutions in large cities have efficient aids in the general intercourse afforded to the people by these places, the parks, in the harmonizing effects of nature, and in those social habits engendered by them which break down the curse of caste among us, resulting most frequently from habits of isolation. We think about the founding of the horticultural societies and the idea that Tamara Plekins Thornton has talked about how moral character, temperance, republican virtue, and even domestic fertility come from the interaction with horticulture. Well, parks like Fairmount Park, those were the public opportunity for the horticulture experience for the masses. And then came the parkway, of course, the idea of bringing that park deep into the city. And we hear James Montgomery Beck supporting the building of the parkway, and he says, "Give to that man when he leaves the factory the inspiration of art. Give him something to feed the divine part of his being, his immortal soul. Let him climb the steps on yonder hill and look down the parkway and see everywhere before him beautiful buildings. Let him do that, and then he has something to feed his soul. And no matter whether he lives in a garret or a marble palace, he has the instinct of beauty latent within him, and you have fed it and prevented it from being starved." Well, we might be a little critical of the paternalism of that today, but there it is. We also recognize that the overlay of a certain image of the city, a European model, also erased another part of the city, a living and existing fabric. So the bringing of this concept to the city may be seen in all of its great lights, but it can also be seen critically. We can question it. And it brings us even to the 1960s and the crisis of the riots in Philadelphia, the '64 Columbia Avenue riots, in a part of North Philly described as the jungle. The jungle, that's the opposite of the garden. That's an uncultivated wilderness. And out of that, and the lack of investment in civic landscapes, there wasn't a great movement at that time, but what there was the gardening movement. Originally the Neighborhood Gardening Association, and ultimately Philadelphia Green, whose great work we've talked about today. But those worked at the micro investment level, the grassroots level, the ground up level. And they started by Louise Brush Brown bringing whiskey barrels with flowers and putting them out on street corners, because she honestly believed that if we changed the look of the city, if we put gardens in the city, we would change it. We would change people's lives. She wrote in Garden Blocks for Urban America in '69, quote, "The touches of beauty brought into these dreary, blighted areas have fallen like dew upon the ground, long parched by drought, and have stirred something within the hearts of the people which might have remained forever dormant. And out of this flowering of the spirit have grown a sense of individual dignity and worth, an enlightened vision and faith that much may be accomplished when neighbors work together to improve their communities." And Philadelphia Green and the Horticulture Society that continue this work even as late as 1992 in one of their promotional packets, writing, "Horticulture is active, living, participatory, and responsive. Working together, neighbors learn about horticulture while they build pride in their communities. A corporate executive who grows orchids in a greenhouse can enjoy the same thrill of growth as an inner city child with access to a small plot to plant a sweet potato vine." Amazing rhetoric, but actually a questionable rhetoric as well. What are the stereotypes we're building in this language? What are the divisions we're actually building between city and country, between nature and culture when we talk this way? Today, green is good in the way that greed was good in the '80s. I worry that some of the language we use is so comfortable and so simple and so ingrained that it becomes as saccharine as these ads for Coke and Pepsi. How do we make sure we don't become this? When we sell cars, are we just selling the same image that in 1871 was being sold by the ladies' floral cabinet? If we just get out into nature, our family will be good. So I pose the question to the panelists today. I want to frame a challenge for them. I want to get past the rhetoric. I want to get past the simple language. I want to ask you hard questions about the scenic, the cultural, the environmental, the economic, the values that you bring to the landscape. I want to ask you to talk about the work, not just in what you build, but in the way you talk about it, in the way you support it, in the way we build our work, and the way we develop the language that we talk about it, and how do we identify true values, metrics, performance that get beyond this very simple language and provide a real basis for moving forward. So with that, I want to hand it over to Sue Weiler.